This is a great question. So let's talk about the NIV. I have a lot of videos on my study tips playlist on TikTok, also loaded over on my YouTube, that go over different Bible translations in detail. One of my least favorite translations is the NIV and the NLT, but let me explain to you why that is. First of all, you need to know that there's no such thing as a perfect translation. Just throw that idea right out the window because it doesn't exist. We're talking about Bibles that have been translated from various different manuscripts through 2 or 3 or 4 different languages over the course of thousands of years. Sometimes there's just something lost in translation, a cultural reference that you're not going to get, stuff like that. But excluding those kind of details from our equation, the reason I don't like the NIV and the NLT is because they are thought-for-thought translations. They're not word-for-word translations. A couple of my favorite mainstream Bible translations are the ESV and the NASB. I have videos about those in detail if you're curious. But the reason I like them is because they use older manuscripts, closer to the time Jesus actually walked, and they do their best to be a word-for-word translation. Which means when you have a Greek or a Hebrew word, they string together whatever 1, 2, or 3 words make up this one Hebrew or Greek word. And they do that as best as they can. Again, this doesn't always come out perfect. This is why we need to use lexicons and concordances to verify what's being said in the Bible translations. But the NIV and the NLT are thought-for-thought translations. So instead of finding the 1 or 2 or 3 English words that would match the Greek or the Hebrew word, what they say is, we think this sentence is basically getting at this concept, so we're going to put it in our own words. And I see why they did that. I don't necessarily think that the people that translated the NIV or NLT had any nefarious ideas. They just implanted some of their doctrinal ideas into the text where it doesn't actually exist. A really bad instance of this is if you go and read the Old Testament, the Torah, in the NIV, you'll see ceremonial law this, ceremonial law that, and it doesn't actually exist in the manuscripts. There's no such thing as a ceremonial law per the actual manuscripts. But because of this doctrinal idea that ceremonial laws exist, they have implanted that into the text. And doing things like that makes it a far less reliable Bible to read and study. When you look at the manuscripts, the word-for-word translations do a much better job of portraying what's actually being spoken. There is one thing I want you all to know, though. Just because I say the NIV and the NLT are bad translations doesn't mean you can't actually read them. In fact, one of the really redeeming qualities of the NIV is its readability. It is one of the easiest Bibles out there to read, which is why people like it so much. It's just not a great Bible to deeply study. And most people pick one Bible that they like and then they put all their eggs in that basket instead of testing the different manuscripts and the different translations and really looking into it. If you know exactly what the NIV is, if you know it's a thought-for-thought translation, and you know that they add certain words here or there, or certain phrases to this certain sentence, and you know exactly what they're doing, it's not a bad translation to read. But the problem is most people don't know what the NIV is, and they don't know about these added in words and that it's not a word-for-word translation. And that is where it steers you down a bad road if you don't know what the NIV is and you're using it as your only item to study, your only translation, your only Bible, and that's a bad thing to do. I have a few audio Bibles I like, and one of my favorite ones is the dramatized NIV. And it's because it's really fun to listen to. It makes it sound like you're kind of listening to a TV show or something like that. And it's a great Bible to actually listen to. Now, I know exactly what the NIV is. I've spent all the time looking over this translation, looking at the editor's notes, figuring out what they did when they were translating this Bible. So I can read and listen to that one all day long, and it won't affect my actual beliefs of what the scriptures say. And if you have studied the NIV enough to know that, then it's fine if you read the NIV. It's fine if you read the KJV. I'm also not a big fan of that one. A lot of people say the KJV is the only inspired word of God. If you don't read it, whatever, all this evil stuff floating around the internet, that's the only Bible you should read. I have so many videos showing errors in the KJV, it's insane. But again, I know exactly what the KJV is. So I can read the KJV all day long and it won't be an issue for me. What I'm really getting at is that you need to know what your translation is. If you have studied it in the manuscripts and read all the editor's notes, and you know that they added this word onto this verse or whatever, then it's fine if you read the NIV or the KJV or any other Bible translation. But if you haven't done that, some of the thought-for-thought variations in the NIV can definitely be misleading when compared to the original text. I personally don't believe that we should put all of our eggs into one basket when it comes to Bible translations. Like I said, there's a lot of different variances out there, and even the word-for-word translations do have plenty of errors. If you were to ask me what Bibles I recommend to people based on all the studying I have done throughout the various manuscripts, I would say that the ESV, the NASV, and the New King James Version are probably at the top of the list for mainstream Bible translations. I also really like the TS 2009 and the TLV. And when it comes to the Old Testament, for sure, you need to get yourself a Septuagint, because I believe the Septuagint is far more accurate than anything in the Old Testament Masoretic text, which is what pretty much every mainstream Bible translation uses for the Old Testament. Personally, I study the Brenton's Septuagint and the ESV probably more often than all the other ones, just because those are my favorites that I commonly use. But if I'm really digging deep into a certain verse or into a certain chapter, that's when I'll bounce around throughout the different manuscripts, the different translations, and see what the variations are. Bible Hub is a really good app for comparing all the various mainstream Bible translations. You can see a certain verse or a certain word in the manuscript throughout 20, 25 different mainstream Bible translations. Then after that, you can bounce around to the different manuscripts and read those and see what the variation is. We have Hebrew Gospels of the New Testament. We have Syriac. We have the Textus Vaticanus. We have the Samaritan Torah. I mean, we have all kinds of different manuscripts to validate and get another witness to whatever we're studying. But the whole point of this video is to make sure you know what you are reading and studying. If you have done your due diligence and you know exactly what the NIV is, you know exactly what the KJV is, you know exactly what any other Bible manuscript is, and you can objectively say, okay, I know there's some errors here, this isn't the perfect only Bible that people need to read, then you're going to be in a good spot where you can read anything and study it, and you'll be able to know what they did to this manuscript or that manuscript and how they translated it, and then that will help you in your studies. As long as you put in the time and effort to understand what translation you choose to read the most, you'll probably be just fine. Even if it is an NIV. I just wouldn't suggest the NIV for deep studies. If you're curious about the ESV translation and why I use that one the most, I have videos about it in my study tips playlist and on YouTube. If you're curious about why I don't recommend the KJV either, I also have a bunch of videos about that.